I recently upgraded my composing computer to new Mac Studio, and I've been getting some questions from other composers about it. Two of the main questions that I get are how much RAM and how much internal storage should I buy? And unfortunately, nobody's running the kind of specific tests that are helpful to us as composers. If you search YouTube, the most that you're usually going to find is somebody trying to run like 300 tracks of Omnisphere or something. How about somebody tell me whether I should put my Kontakt instruments on the internal drive or an external drive? Now that's what we're going to find out. This will be the first of 2 videos. In this one, I'll share my experiences with the Mac Studio, and I'll be comparing the speed of hosting samples on the internal drive versus hosting them on an external USB drive, so you can decide for yourself how much internal storage and RAM you need to buy. Then, in the next video, I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison between running VE Pro directly on the Mac Studio versus running a disabled track template, including showing you loading times, save times, and more. So the system I have is essentially the maxed out M2 Ultra with 192 gigabytes of RAM and the 8 terabyte SSD. However, the tests I ran should be useful for anyone currently considering a new Mac with Apple Silicon. I've been using this Mac Studio to score film and game projects for a couple months now, and it's been an amazing upgrade from my previous iMac Pro from 2017. No matter how many instruments I load up, it doesn't break a sweat, which bodes really well for me not needing to replace it for a long time. I also like that it's completely silent, so I can record in here and there's no issues with fan noise. It generates no heat, which has really made my studio a lot more comfortable as well. One of the biggest things I've noticed has been the responsiveness of the Apple Silicon versus the previous Intel chips. I'm not talking about raw horsepower of a big render job, but just the quickness and the latency of when I click and when something happens. It just feels much snappier. So if you pick up one of these new machines, I also recommend grabbing one of these Touch ID keyboards. This is going to save you from typing your password a few million times when you're first setting up and installing software. It took me about 2 days to get the new Mac set up. Installing the software went very quickly because the installers go super fast. And moving stuff over like Cubase preferences, Metagrid macros, that stuff took a little longer. And by the way, I definitely recommend keeping your old system for at least a few weeks while you get set up because there are definitely some preferences and such I needed to grab from my old iMac. So let's talk about RAM. One of the most common questions I see asked online is, how much RAM do I need for composing? And then also, can I get by with less RAM with Apple Silicon? Before I answer that, I need to show you how I set up my Mac Studio to use the lowest possible RAM for samples. I've been able to lower my Kontakt instrument preload buffer size to just 6 kilobytes from the default of 60 kilobytes. Make sure to do this from within your DAW, and it will take effect for every instance. Then, for the Sign Player from Orchestral Tools, I lowered the DFD preload buffer from 250 to 50. This lowers your RAM usage dramatically. If you combine this with doing mic merges in Sign, you can lower your RAM usage by like 80 or 90%. Unlike in Kontakt, this isn't a global setting, so you need to do it for every instrument. I went ahead and set up a keyboard macro to speed this up. So after those optimizations, let's take a look at RAM usage. So we're going to talk all about VE Pro in the next video, but for now, my VE Pro server is using around 102 gigabytes of RAM, with the Mac using 132 gigabytes. And I'm not sure why the Mac OS RAM is so high, but I'm guessing the RAM from some of the samples is showing up under Mac OS instead of VE Pro. Anyway, this is almost 1700 tracks, so it's definitely on the more extreme end of templates. Then, in addition to my VE Pro template, I also created an entirely new version of my template, using disabled tracks. Using that as a starting point, I created a typical orchestral project that has 116 tracks enabled and loaded into RAM. This is made up of a combination of Kontakt, Sign Player, and Spitfire Audio's Abbey Road Orchestra Player. So this project is showing 26 gigabytes of RAM used in Cubase, with 41 gigabytes total used by macOS. So if you're shopping for a Mac and you want to run a decent sized orchestral template,
I'd consider 64 gigabytes a minimum for a disabled track workflow. And if you're considering using VE Pro and running your server directly on the Mac Studio, and I do highly recommend running your server locally on the Mac for reasons I'll explain in the next video, then you probably want to get the 192 gigabyte option, or at least go with 128 gigabytes and have fewer tracks loaded.
So back to the question, can I get by with less RAM with Apple Silicon?
Well, as the tests show, even with the buffer lowered, we still needed 41 gigabytes for a good-sized orchestral project. Now, if you tried to run that 41 gigabyte project with only 16 or 32 gigabytes, while I haven't tested that, I do know it's going to start having to swap data from the SSD, and that quickly slows things down, and then your only option would be to start bouncing stuff to disk.
Since the RAM in the Mac Studio is not upgradable, I highly recommend you get the amount of RAM you think you might need down the line. Another question that composers have when considering one of these new Macs is, should I pay extra for more internal storage to put my samples on, since that storage is so much faster?
The internal drive of my Mac Studio gets around 5,300 megabytes per second. Now, I also have a Glyph Atom Pro Thunderbolt 3 drive that gets around 2,500 megabytes a second. Then finally, I have various standard USB SSDs that get around 400 megabytes a second. So let's see if putting the samples on the internal drive makes any difference, or if we can save some money by using external USB drives for samples. I ran separate tests for both Kontakt and SignPlayer, so let's start with Kontakt. I created a test project with 178 tracks of Kontakt, made up of some of the most popular libraries, so Cinematic Studio Strings, Cinematic Studio Brass, Spitfire Symphonic Strings, and LA Modern Percussion. I did a batch resave of all the libraries once they were on the drive, and I clicked on Reload All Samples so that all the samples would be loaded into RAM. And keep in mind, we're using a Kontakt preload size of 6 kilobytes instead of the default 60 kilobytes. I also rebooted the Mac Studio before running each test. This is important because when you close a project, a lot of the samples still remain in RAM. If you were to relaunch the same project, you'll get a much faster loading time. So we need to reboot to get an accurate comparison. So now I know why nobody runs these benchmarks for composers. Because copying all these samples from drive to drive and then relinking all the samples and then running screen captures on all these tests, it took forever. But I was comforted by the fact that everyone watching this video would give it a like and subscribe to my channel, and that made it all worth it. The first thing we're going to do is compare how long it took for the Cubase project to load. With the samples on the internal SSD, the project loaded in 1 minute and 26 seconds. And with the samples on the external USB SSD, the load time was 1 minute and 32 seconds. That's a pretty minor difference considering the internal drive speed test is 10 times faster. In fact, I had to run this test again just to check the result, and it came out the same. But what about the time it takes to enable and disable tracks? So I checked the amount of time it took to enable 30 tracks of Cinematic Studio Strings. This took 22 seconds from the internal drive, and exactly the same 22 seconds from the external. And disabling the tracks was also the exact same time, 4 seconds for each. Then, I tested the time it took to bounce a stereo reference. This is the first test where we really see any difference, and it's not a huge one. With the samples on the internal drive, this took 3 minutes and 24 seconds. And with the samples on the external USB drive, this took 4 minutes, a difference of around 15%. To me, this isn't enough of a speed increase to justify loading up your internal drive with Kontakt samples. So the verdict? Well, when it comes to Kontakt, don't waste your money on anything more than a standard USB SSD. So next I wanted to test SignPlayer because Sign is a much newer player than Kontakt, and I wanted to see if it takes better advantage of faster SSD speeds. So I created a project with 312 tracks of Orchestral Tools Sign instruments. Now remember, every instance of Sign has the DFT buffer set to 50 instead of the default 250 to save on RAM. Again, we're comparing the internal drive, which gets 5,300 megabytes per second on the speed test, to a Glyph USB SSD, which gets around 400.
Loading the Cubase project with Sign instruments on the internal drive took 1 minute and 40 seconds, compared to 2 minutes and 51 seconds from the external. So here we're getting a pretty big benefit from using the internal drive. Then I tested enabling and disabling tracks in Sine. Enabling all of the Berlin Strings tracks took 20 seconds on the internal, compared to the exact same 20 seconds on the external. Disabling all of Berlin Strings took 11 seconds on the internal, compared to, again, 11 seconds on the external. So disk speed seems to make no difference in the time it takes to enable or disable tracks. Then I tested bouncing a stereo reference track. With the Sine samples on the internal drive, this took 2 minutes and 19 seconds. And with the samples on the USB drive, this took basically the same, 2 minutes and 20 seconds. So unlike Kontakt, for Sine, disk speed doesn't seem to have any effect on rendering time. So the big difference for Sine is project load times. And since there's a difference between the internal and the standard USB SSD, I decided to test a middle option, which is my Glyph Atom Pro Thunderbolt 3 drive. This drive tests around 2500 megabytes per second, so kind of right in the middle. So with all the Sine samples on this drive, the Cubase project load time was 2 minutes and 43 seconds. I was a bit surprised by this because it's very close to the USB time. So the verdict for Sine seems to be that the internal drive does make a difference for project loading time. So for me, I'll be keeping my Sine instruments stored on the internal drive. But we're talking about a savings of 1 minute here, and that's for an uncommonly large 300 track project. So if you don't mind waiting that extra minute, you can save money by using an external USB SSD. And then finally, I wanted to run a stress test. With 1,700 instruments loaded into VE Pro, how many can we play simultaneously? 200? 300? Let's find out. Now I don't know about you, but I don't anticipate writing a cue where the woodwinds, brass, and strings are all playing back every long and short articulation all at once. But with a buffer of 1024, I was able to play back 570 tracks. Then, with the buffer lowered down to 192, the track count was 317 tracks. Now it's great to see that the CPU utilization is very balanced among all the cores, and despite working hard, the Mac is still silent. I gotta say, I think this music is starting to grow on me. Maybe some of my finest work. So if you're in the market for a new Mac, hopefully some of these tests will help you decide what configuration might be right for you. The minimum spec I'd recommend for a Mac Studio would be the M2 Max with 64 gigabytes of RAM and a 1 terabyte SSD, which currently comes out to around $25.99. Now if you want to run a big VE Pro template all on one machine, then I'd recommend the M2 Ultra with 192 gigabytes of RAM. Hosting your samples on an external Thunderbolt or USB drive is a great option to save on cost. I hope this video has been helpful for you. And if you're a composer who has some experience with one of these new Macs, let me know in the comments what it's been like so far. I think that would be a great resource for other composers who are considering buying a new Mac. Now in part 2 of this video series, I'm going to compare a VE Pro template running on the Mac Studio to a disabled track template as well. Until then, we'll see you next time.